Hello students, today we're going to look at section 9.8, which is the last section of this chapter, and it's all about factoring polynomials completely. So basically what we're doing in this section is wrapping everything else together. So we're going to see differences of squares, we'll see perfect square trinomials, we'll see trinomials that can be factored, we'll just see all kinds of stuff, and we're going to keep factoring until I can't factor anymore. So the first thing that we're going to look at is factoring out a common binomial factor. Okay, so I have 4x times the quantity of x minus 3. That would be one group. And then 5 times the quantity of x minus 3. Well, what's the greatest common binomial factor? X minus 3. So I'm going to factor out x minus 3 from each of these. And if I do 4x times the quantity of x minus 3 divided by x minus 3, all I'm left with is 4x. And then if I do 5 times the quantity of x minus 3 divided by x minus 3, all I'm left with is positive 5. So there are my two binomial factors. X times 3 times the quantity of 4x plus 5. I know that takes a little bit of time to get your head wrapped around it, but just think of this x minus 3 as like one term. It just happens to be a binomial. So we're just factoring out, and I'll just kind of do, if I factor out x minus 3, those cancel out, so I'm left with 5. So that's just a little bit more on how this happens. The next example is the same process, x times the quantity of x minus 2 plus x minus 2. Well, I'm going to factor out my greatest binomial factor, which again is x minus 2, and I divide each group by x minus 2. So x times quantity of x minus 2 divided by x minus 2 is just x. And here's where it gets tricky. Remember, there's a 1 right here, but we don't have to put the 1. So x minus 2 divided by x minus 2 is 1, so it'd be plus 1. So my factors are x minus 2 times the quantity of x plus 1. And here's the last sample problem in this section. I have 2y squared times the quantity of y minus 5 minus 3 times the quantity of 5 minus y. Well, unfortunately, y minus 5 and 5 minus y are not the same. In this one, 5 is negative, and this one, the y is negative, so they are not the same. But I can do something to make them the same. I can take 5 minus y, multiply this entire term by negative 1, and it would change 5 minus y to y minus 5. Again, all I'm doing is taking this, multiplying it by negative 1. So I have 2y squared times quantity of y minus 5 plus 3 times the quantity of negative 5 plus y. And then I'm going to switch that around to 2y squared times y minus 5 plus 3 times y minus 5. And now I can factor out my greatest binomial factor, which is y minus 5 times the quantity of 2y squared plus 3. And those are my two binomial factors of 2y squared times the quantity of y minus 5 minus 3 times the quantity of 5 minus y. Again, if you have them just in the wrong order with a minus in there, multiply one set by a negative, and then you're good to go. The next section, go ahead and draw a squiggly line. The next section is factor by grouping. Now I am given x to the third plus 2x squared plus 8x plus 16. Now we haven't dealt with polynomials with 4 terms yet, so we're always going to check to see if there's a greatest common factor, and there's not. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to group these into 2 binomials. Notice that all of my x's are in order by exponent. That's very important. That must happen in order for this to work. So I'm going to group by pairs, and then I'm going to factor out a greatest common factor. The greatest common factor here is x squared. So I divide both by x squared and I get x plus 2, plus the greatest common factor here is 8, and I'm going to factor out 8, so that'd be x plus 2. Now, if you look at this, this is exactly like what we just did in factoring out a common binomial factor. My common binomial factor is x plus 2. So x squared times quantity of x plus 2 divided by x plus 2 is x squared. And then 8 times quantity of x plus 2 divided by x plus 2 would be just plus 8. So there are my two binomial factors, x plus 2 times the quantity of x squared plus 8. On this one, I have x to the third minus 10 minus 5x plus 2x squared. Now, I told you just a second ago that I have to have all the terms in order from least to greatest by the exponent. So I've got to switch this around before I can group. So I'm going to do x to the third plus 2x squared minus 5x minus 10. Now I can group. I'm going to group the first two, and I'm going to group the last two. Notice that I'm putting the minus sign inside. That's important. You got to put if it's a minus sign, it has to go inside the parentheses. If it's a plus sign, it doesn't matter. So x to the third plus 2x squared. Again, my common factor is x squared times the quantity of x plus 2. And then I'm going to factor out negative 5 times the quantity of x plus 2. And now I factor out my greatest common binomial, which is x plus 2. And then I divide everything by that, and I get x squared minus 5. That's supposed to be a 5. And that doesn't look like a 5 either. So here's our 5. And there's my answer, x plus 2 times the quantity of x squared minus 5. The next problem we're going to do from this section is r squared plus 4r plus rs plus 4s. And remember, we have 4 terms in our polynomial, so we need to group them just like this. And we're going to factor out our greatest common factor for each pair. And the greatest common factor for r squared and 4r is r. So this would be r plus 4. And the greatest common factor for rs and 4s is s. So plus s, and that's r plus 4. And now I factor out our greatest common binomial, which would be r plus 4 times the quantity of r plus s. Again, if we have 4 terms in our polynomial, group them, and then factor out the greatest common factor. The last section that we're going to look at is factoring completely. That means that you may have to do a couple of different types of factoring before you can finally get to an answer. So I'm going to look at 4x to the third minus 4x squared plus 96x equals 0. First thing we always look for is the greatest common factor, which in this case would be 4x. So I'm going to factor out 4x from each term. 4x to the third divided by 4x is x squared. Negative 44x squared divided by 4x is negative 11x. And 96x divided by 4x is positive 24. And it still equals 0. So I have my 4x. I'm just going to leave it alone. But I need to see how I can factor x squared minus 11x plus 24. Well, thankfully a is 1. So I just need to find 2 factors of 24 that add up to negative 11. And I know both of those factors are going to be negative, so I'm going to use negative 8 and negative 3. So 4x times the quantity of x minus 8 and x minus 3 equals 0. Because x times x is x squared, outsides is negative 8, outside's negative 3, inside's negative 8, add up to negative 11, and then negative 8 times negative 3 is positive 24. So now I've got to figure out what 0 is. I have 3 factors now, so I'm going to have 3 answers. The first one would be 4x equals 0, so x equals 0. X minus 8 equals 0, so x equals 8. And then x minus 3 equals 0, so x equals 3. So my answers would be 0, 8, or 3. Again, I factored it completely, and I know you can't see that, so I'm going to adjust this a little bit. I factored completely till I got all the way down to my answers, which are 0, 8, or 3. The last problem for this section is 50h to the fourth minus 2h squared. First thing I always look for is a greatest common factor, and I know that my greatest common factor is going to be 2 for 2 and 50, and then h squared, so 2h squared. And then factor it out. 50h to the fourth divided by 2h squared is 25h squared. And then negative 2h squared divided by 2h squared is negative 1. And I think, is there anything else I can do? Well, it's a binomial, so I need to look and see, is this a difference of squares? Is 25h squared a perfect square? Yes. Is 1 a perfect square? Yes. So then I have 2h squared times the quantity of 5h minus 1 and 5h plus 1. And now I have factored this completely. Here are your 4 practice problems for tonight. The first one is 4x times the quantity of x plus 3 minus 3 times the quantity of x plus 3. Factor out the greatest binomial factor and give me the 2 binomials. For number 2, y squared plus 2y plus yx plus 2x. Group these, factor out the greatest common factor, and then figure out what your binomials are. For number 3, 4y cubed plus 8y squared minus 4y equals 0. First of all, remove the greatest common factor and then factor as you can. And then make sure you put the equals 0 and solve all the way. And then number 4 is 3x to the third plus 18x squared equals negative 24x. Remember, bring everything to one side and let it equal 0. Greatest common factors, factor it out, and tell me what x equals. Please take a picture of your work, not just the answers. Show me your work and submit it through Edmodo.